One of the things about music that has always intrigued me is why is music so pervasive throughout human history and throughout every culture? It's pretty amazing when you start to study every civilization that we've known. There has been something happening at every level of human existence that we would maybe call music or some kind of music making. Or maybe even more basically how sound gets processed in societies and what its usefulness is. So I want to talk just a little bit about, as we think about digital sound and what is the purpose of sound, let's talk about why sound is so important to sort of us as humans and where it comes from, and when do we first start experiencing sound and thinking about sound, and why does sound carry certain kind of evolutionary benefits, maybe is one of the questions. When we listen to sound, we can hear sound in the auditory domain. We've talked about how the brain has this very sophisticated processing system for taking the information from the physical vibrations coming through the air and converting that into information which we perceive as sound. So the auditory nerve and the auditory processing is what we think of as sound. But what I realized through much of my career is that sound, when we're listening to sound, we're also being affected by the kind of the visual aspect of where the sound is coming from, the sound source, who's making the sound, and sometimes that can color the way we hear, and the aesthetic response to the perception of that is determined both by the auditory and the visual. There's also a kind of a kinesthetic quality to that, where the body is involved. So if we look quickly at, for example, a score, this is a musical score behind that of a flute piece. In some ways, the musical score is a representation of the music, but it's also a set of directions for the body. And that's why thinking about music as a kinesthetic experience is kind of interesting, because when you have these little bits of ink on the page that the flutist is following, it's telling them information about what they need to do with their breath, with their fingers, with their lip muscles, with everything about their body is involved in that set of directions. So the directions, we're hearing it as sound, but the directions really are for a performer to use their body in a certain way. So it's really a kinesthetic set of directions. The layer on top of that is this is a piece for flute with live electronics, and this is the other part of the score, which was the computer program that is in Max MSP, which is a program we'll talk about a little bit later, where I design my own interaction. So you'll see this is another kind of score necessarily for this, which gives the information about what's happening with the electronic interaction of that physical gesture coming off the flutist. So when we talk about sound, in some ways we're talking more than about just the auditory aspect of sound in human experience. There's a visual and there's a kinesthetic response to that. So that when we see something like a taiko drumming group ensemble, part of the experience of taiko drumming from a Japanese group is the physicality of playing the sounds. Not just the sounds themselves, but to watch the full body in a very athletic kind of mode of playing that sound is what we're perceiving the energy of the experience from. So for me, this perception of sound and how we think about sound, it's important that we realize that there's a lot more going on to sound than just in the auditory domain. So let's talk about how music and maybe evolved. So one of the theories about music is that it has always promoted different kind of group cohesion. So when we go back and look at early civilizations, sort of tribal communities, there's a lot about music that bonds that particular community together. There's a sense that it strengthens the emotional bonds between a mother and its offspring, mother and infant. Or that music is a way to transmit a lot of important information to the community very quickly all at once. So that it has a kind of a basic ability to bond groups together and to give them some way of protecting themselves and to feel that there is a connection to them beyond the sort of familial connections. This socio-emotional bonding is important too. When we are speaking to each other, there's kind of an emotional bond that happens when we hear the voice of someone we recognize. And you see that from birth as well. There's another theory that music and dance acts as maybe indicators in group stability. There's a theory that perhaps when you look at apes, monkeys spend a great deal of their day grooming each other. And part of that grooming is not just for health benefits, but it's for a way of bonding them to each other so that there is a sense of community, of protection, for providing shared resources and for signaling each other when there's danger. So there's some theories that early on in human history that maybe singing and dancing was a substitute for the grooming aspect, where we can sing and dance together and feel that same bond connection. So that socio-emotional bonding is important. I see this all the time in music groups when you find people who sing together in a chorus, for example, and they feel some kind of special connection with each other because the act of actually singing together bonds them in a way that other activities will not. A third thing that you find in different species is that the quality of a sound of a particular species is a way of identifying sexual attraction. So if you're trying to find the best gene pool from a group, often you do that by listening to the song of that bird or of that ape or whatever it is that you're trying to attract. So sexual selection has always been a part of identifying who is the dominant male, who is the most attractive female, or whatever is going on, that we find that same idea. And Charles Darwin is the first one to propose this idea that there is some sort of perhaps sexual evolution in the interpretation of sound. That's an important part of that. So when we look at early development of how emotions and music and cognitive develop, it's really interesting when you look at even 2 months old, there is a demonstration of preference to consonance and dissonance, which is happening very early in the development. By 3 years old, most children can identify happy in music. When you play music which we recognize as happy, a 3-year-old can start to determine that happiness and tell when music has that ability. By 5-year-old, they can differentiate between happy and sad generally. And by 6-year-old, they can have more nuanced understanding of emotions between sadness, fear, anger. Those kind of devices can be understood. And pitch recognition happens very early on. By the age 5, most North American children can detect when a key change or a note is not part of a key. So if you're playing a series of notes, they will detect that note is not part of that major scale or whatever the key is. That's by the age of 5. By the age of 6, the child can understand both key and harmony relationships when a harmony is not part of a traditional diatonic structure. And then by 9 to 12 years old, they have complete tonal skills developed. So the formal training for music also is interesting to understand that when students or children are trained in formal training of music before the age of 7, you can see a result of that. If you do an fMRI, a magnetic imaging of the brain, you can actually see pathways that are developed in children who had formal music training before the age of 7. So without knowing anything else, you can look for different parts of the brain. There is actually more cognitive benefit to having heard music at an early age. So there's some efficiencies in cognitive function that music actually has been shown to demonstrate. So infants pay more attention to their mother's infant-directed singing than to infant-directed singing. So what happens is if you speak to a child, the child will not pay as much attention to the mother's voice as if the mother sings to the child. And here is a little example of a clip of a child, and you can sort of see the kind of way that mothers automatically speak to children is in a very affected, dynamic tone of voice. And this is in some ways universal. Studies have shown that throughout most civilizations, mothers will automatically speak in what is referred to now as kind of a motherese kind of speaking voice, or it's an attunement to that. And that gives that kind of lyrical sung style because they can tell that the child pays more attention when they go into that very affected kind of pitch. So here's a quick example of something where the child is responding to the mother's voice.
Hi, can you smile? Oh, look, you're so cute. Yeah? You took a nap, huh? Was it a good nap? Huh? Yeah. That's a good boy.
So you can see very early on in a few months, the child is smiling when it hears that motherese voice. Not understanding a word that's being said, perhaps, but is understanding both the quality, the timbre of the voice is important, and as well as the inflection of the mother's voice. And that child can recognize that voice. So is there a particular reason why it's important in the auditory processing that an infant be able to recognize the quality of the voice and recognize the mother's voice? And it's been shown that in herding animals or where you have large groups of species like penguins or so forth, when you're hearing a cacophony of voices, the mother and the offspring can identify each other's voice very quickly in that cacophony of sounds. And when you look at the difference between those sounds, there's very subtle, nuanced differences in the spectrum of that mother's voice that differentiates it between other members of the species. And so the brain from birth has this ability to process timbre in a very robust way. Perhaps that's maybe the most important part of cognitive process. So in this one, you can see that the child, as soon as you turn on the hairdryer, it pacifies, it relaxes. As soon as the hairdryer is turned off, it becomes irritated and starts to cry. This will happen on vacuum cleaners, anything that has white noise in it. And what this is kind of another universal trait is that the white noise is very similar to the sound that the child is hearing in the womb. Through the rushing of the blood and the heart is a kind of a very much a white noise kind of quality. There are voices that you can hear in the womb, but they're muffled so much that you don't get any kind of definition. So what makes the child feel comfortable at an early age is the sound of white noise of vacuum cleaners and hair dryers that is being processed. So in some ways, the aesthetic response to timbre is happening in the womb, where we're automatically being predisposed to preference a certain sound gives us security and gives us an emotional reaction to sound even before birth is happening. You can sort of see that in that particular child's crying.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.